Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sunset TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. As a tribute to the friend of India, we look back at how Shinzo Abe advanced India-Japan ties and the contours of our relations post his demise. Joining us with their perspectives are three eminent panelists on the program. So let me begin first by introducing them to you. With me in the studio is Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU. Professor, thank you for your time. Welcome to Sunset TV. And joining us virtually is Mr. Professor Rajiv Shaw, Director, India-Japan Laboratory, Kyoto University, Japan. Professor Shaw, thank you for your time. And also pleased to have Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's a foreign affairs expert. Dr. Chaulia, glad to have you on this edition of Perspective. Dr. Chaulia, if you could give us a sense of how significant are personal relationships, personal chemistry when it comes to elevating bilateral relationships. We've seen how Prime Minister Modi on several occasions has mentioned Mr. Abe as a great, true friend of India, and the significant aspect that he himself has flown to Tokyo to pay personal tribute alongside several other world leaders. How significant is the aspect of personal chemistry between bilateral relationships of two countries, according to you?
They do matter insofar as if there is a convergence of interests and if the top leaders have a friendly bond. In fact, Modi and Abe, it was called a bromance, and it was probably the most lasting and consequential bromance. The reason this helps is because, Japan, India had a strategic and global partnership even before Modi and Abe.
Right.
But we elevated it to special strategic and global partnership. And if you look at the investment volumes, FDI from Japan to India, they shot up like threefold, or in some years even went up fourfold after Prime Minister Modi and Abe got closer and indicated to their respective bureaucracies and to the lower level officials that they prioritize this at the highest level and that they want this relationship to flourish and go even better. So I think those signaling from the top matters a lot. And of course, I think new ideas, innovative forms of cooperation have come. It's not just FDI and trade which have improved. You look at the defense component. I mean, the way in which we have moved. Now we have even signed a reciprocal logistics agreement of the two militaries. We have the 2+2, as my co-panelist mentioned. So the defense component has come a far way because of Shinzo Abe. Had he not been there, you can imagine the Japanese polity is kind of bureaucratic and slow and conservative. But he was what I call a radical conservative. And he wanted drastic change in the Japan's foreign policy, in its defense posture, and its military alignments. So as a result of that, if you do a counterfactual, and suppose there was no Shinzo Abe, we would have had 1 or 2 year, revolving door in Japanese politics. No prime minister lasted more than 2 years before Abe-san came in. So what he did was create that space for stable and long-term planning. And that's where Prime Minister Modi came in. They were, birds of a feather flock together. And that's why they got so close, because Prime Minister Modi also wanted a long-term strategic approach to Indo-Pacific. And we all know that had it not been for Modi and Abe, there would be no Quad revival. There would be no Indo-Pacific that
Absolutely.
we talk about. Because earlier it was just the Americans who were talking about Indo-Pacific.
That's a significant point, Professor Chaulia. Let me hear what Professor Chaudhary has to say on that. Dr. Chaulia, let me come back to you, and sorry to have interrupted you earlier on, but this is one aspect on the Indo-Pacific that I want your opinion on. Mr. Abe is remembered as the architect of the Indo-Pacific policy, and he saw New Delhi at the heart of this policy. Part one of the question, how did he have that confidence in India? How did he look at India, playing a central role when it comes to his Indo-Pacific vision? And part two is, now with him gone, can the current leadership live up to the expectations, live up to the vision that Mr. Abe had regarding the Indo-Pacific?
Tina, how did Shinzo Abe come up with the Indo-Pacific vision? He comes from a background of nationalistic politicians who wanted to break the shackles of the US-imposed Pacific Constitution and the pacifism that came after World War II, the US occupation. So he wanted to shake off a lot of the restrictions. And that's where he started looking at other partners and other pillars of support over and above the United States. Because the traditional Japanese doctrine was, we just rely on the US for our security. They provide us with the umbrella, both during the Cold War, even after the Cold War, even despite the Chinese threat, they had a belief that they just need to piggyback on the US. And of course, they host a large number of American troops and bases even now. But I think Shinzo Abe realized that it has to be US plus. And there he looked around, and it was quite clear, because the question of the credibility of US security commitments in Indo-Pacific was quite clear. And so he wanted actually regional partners. And that's a great innovation of Shinzo Abe, because he really pushed for regional groupings, or what he called broader Asia. He was looking at not just in Asia of South Korea and Japan and Philippines and a few other treaty allies of the US. He was looking to broaden the coalition, because he was one of the very early people who realized that the Chinese were going to come at all the smaller countries with an expansionist and hegemonic vision. So I think he looked at India as one of those critical linchpins through which Japan can actually become, quote unquote, a normal country again, after breaking free from the old self-imposed and the US imposed restrictions. What happens after Shinzo Abe? I will say that it is a very difficult shoe to fill. Already Yoshihide Suga came in and he left very quickly, and now we have Fumio Kishida, and he may be struggling with the opinion polls a bit already with public opinion. So I think the kind of aura and charisma and ability to carry large amounts of bureaucracies and as well as public opinion that Shinzo Abe had is going to be difficult to replace. But the vision that he set is still continuing. He has institutionalized a lot of changes. For example, the goal Fumio Kishida has announced, the current prime minister, 2% GDP spending on defense. This was the ideal, because earlier Japan was not doing that. They were just depending on the US. So now this kind of self-reliant Japan with those multiple partners, especially with India in the center, I think that is going to continue. But you need consensus building in Japan. You always have to carry along many factions within the ruling party, as well as a public opinion which is usually very conservative and not in favor of drastic changes. So I think it will require a lot of fresh leadership to come in and take this forward. But I think they are committed to this now. They have going to spend more on defense. They want to be involved in Southeast Asia. Japan has become very proactive on supporting Taiwan as well. Earlier, it was hesitant. And Japan is calling out China on other issues, such as human rights and situation in Xinjiang and Tibet and all that. So I think Japan is very clear now, whether or not there are shifts in the US policy to the region, it needs to have its own kind of an alliance system or a coalition of its own, which is endogenous to Asia, to the Indo-Pacific. And ultimately, we are the people who will have to balance in Asia, right? Because the US may or may not come in, or it depends on what kind of leadership changes happen in the US. During the Trump era, the Japanese were very worried. Shinzo Abe tried very hard. And that's why I think he's moved in this direction. And this is irreversible. But there could be setbacks because of instability. The old bogey of Japan is instability. And if it comes back, then there may not be continuity of policy and long-term strategic planning for geopolitics. And that is always a fear, but we will hope for the best.
Okay, so Dr. Chaulia, I'll come to you for one last statement, because time allows me to take only one concluding remark. We've spoken about, Mr. Shinzo Abe's legacy, the India-Japan relationship trajectory over the years, and the challenges within the domestic Japanese politics as well. And apart from that, the people-to-people connect is one area where trust needs to be put upon by both sides. But where do you see the future of India-Japan relationship evolving now that, Mr. Abe is no more? We've seen two quick prime ministers since Mr. Abe stepped down. And the fact that, it can't be a one-sided effort. So even if India invests too much into, into Japan in terms of blossoming our relationship further, the fact that it has to reciprocate just like Mr. Abe did. Japan has to also see India as that significant partner that Mr. Abe did. So in terms of that, how do you look at India-Japan relationship now evolving post-Abe?
There is a kind of a multi-partisan consensus in Japan across the spectrum that India matters. But the kind of weightage that Shinzo Abe brought to India relationship was unheralded, unprecedented. So I think that way to expect that to happen now as Japan still handles its domestic problems maybe being too over optimistic. But in the medium to long term, I think the Japanese strategic future lies with India, and they're quite clear about it. And both in the foreign ministry, in the across the civil service and the military, and hopefully the people as well, which of course is a lacuna. I agree. We'll see. I think the idea is that this is an indispensable relationship, because otherwise we can't have balance of power in Asia. You see, and Indo-Pacific, we have willed it into reality. It's a construct that Abe-san himself created, and I think we owe it to him, the generations to come, to build this relationship to unprecedented levels, where it's actually de facto alliance, and that's what we want. We want closer and closer interoperability. Now Japan is also talking about being a player in India's defense market. There's co-production. They want to co-manufacture. If South Korea can become a player in India's defense market, why not Japan? These are new players that are coming in. I think in the long run, the Japanese companies here, there are nearly 1,500 of them in India. They are the real bridges. And Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe worked very hard on building the business to business linkages. And as long as those remain, Prime Minister Modi removed all the hurdles. He created a single window clearance for Japanese investment. That's how we have reached this level now. So this is the role model relationship. We would need to replicate this with other smaller countries in Asia, like Vietnam and Indonesia, which are lesser in economic size than Japan. But Japan is the ideal Indo-Pacific partner, and that's how we have to keep on nurturing this with the top level involvement at the levels of prime ministers. And I'm sure the Prime Minister Modi, he has worked with many successions and transitions, whether it is Trump or Biden, whether it is Abe or Kishida. He is clear that this is our number one or most preferred partner, and we will go to any lengths to remove all the hurdles and to take it to the highest possible level.
Absolutely. In terms of the vision and the impact that Mr. Shinzo Abe had, it was absolutely, unprecedented, phenomenal, as you, rightly mentioned. But the true tribute to Dr. Abe would be with the kind of vision that he had in terms of elevating India-Japan ties and some of these hurdles that have to be surmounted with time that all the panelists have spoken about. So time is running out. That having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Perspective, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have you on the program today.